quickly, I want to get us to Shannon Steen, who I'm very pleased to have here from the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies. And I'm going to introduce our word of the day. And for visitors, we talk about a word of the day at each session to kind of try and tease out some themes that continue through the semester. So we've looked at words like image, text, legibility, and so on. Today, we're going to talk about performance. Now, I'm not going to talk about performance as it's used in the field of performance studies, because Shannon will be able to tell us about that. But in kind of a naive way, I want to ask us to think about two main meanings of performance as it relates to cities. So, in the one sense, performance is about the act of presentation, performance in the sense of a play or a piece of music, one or more people creating something, acting in a way that is observed or listened to by others. And of course, we all perform every day in the city when we get up in the morning and put on our uniforms, whether it's a student, professor, firefighter, sanitation worker, and we play our roles in the theater of the city. Very much like some of my favorite childhood books were Richard Scarry's Busy, Busy World. So when we think of the pig who's a plumber or the bear who's a baker, we all put on our hats and we go out in the theater of the city and do what we do, whether we are consciously performing for others or not. We are part of that theater. The other meaning of performance that interests me relating to the city is the sense of performance, meaning the ability to carry out a specific function relative to expectations. So a building performs in an earthquake well or badly. Materials perform well in weather or under stress. A high performance automobile is different from one that does not measure up. And so performance is often associated with things that we can measure. But the performance of the building is also aesthetic. That's its job. It also needs to perform aesthetically. It's a little harder to measure. But I think what's really interesting in the city is where the two meanings come together. That is, when we have expectations of a space, particularly a public space, is it going to perform in the way that's expected? So in terms of a street performs in terms of level of service of traffic, which essentially traffic engineers measure, and it's very quantitative. Streets also perform in terms of the social interactions that they allow or encourage or discourage. We tend not to measure those as often as they're harder to measure. How many of you have seen a documentary called The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces? Okay, it's a real classic, and it's by William White, W-H-Y-T-E. If you haven't seen it, it's really delightful. I suggest you look it up and watch it on the internet. But what he does is measure the performance of spaces that were designed as plazas based on how people perform within those spaces. And he basically trains a camera on these plazas and observes people the same way we would observe gorillas eating and sitting and mating and resting. He observes people walking and resting and flirting and doing the things they do. And I think it's really interesting to think about what expectations we bring as designers or observers to a space in terms of its performance, and why we choose to judge that space by the way people perform within it. I think I'll stop there because we have an expert on performance here who can speak both to the field of performance studies and specifically on her topic of the day. But before I introduce Shannon Steen, I just want to point out her book that she's not talking about today. It's called The Racial Geometries of the Black, Atlantic, Asian Pacific, and American Theater. And this is just a delightful book. I've loved the first chapter that I've read so far. And it looks at things like the performance of adaptations of Uncle Tom's Cabin in China in the 20th century, and why there's a performance of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the middle of the King and I. It's very complicated, very interesting, and I'm sure that what she will tell us about creative class debates will be equally complicated and interesting. So welcome.
I want to start by thanking Susan for inviting me to come do this. This is the first time that I've actually done a presentation in front of people who work mainly in urban planning. And so I've been trying to figure out how to make some of the ways that humanists talk translate to a different kind of audience. And so you will likely have questions about some of those attempts at some point. Can you leave the light on one side?
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to see what it's.
This is a second one. There we go.
Do you see where we put that? Let's see. So Susan asked me to say something at the beginning of my talk today about what performance studies is. And performance studies really, at its essence, is an interdisciplinary way of thinking about culture that uses performance as kind of a central lens or a central heuristic or metaphor for thinking about the things that culture does and is and how it operates. We're interdisciplinary in the sense that we tend to draw on a lot of different fields for what it is we do. The big ones tend to be things like literary studies, art history, a little bit of anthropology, areas like that. And we tend to use some of the theories and questions and methods from those fields to look at the way, to look at the theatricality of the world in various ways. So we'll look at things like the kinds of obvious forms of performance, like art performance, so things like theater or dance or performance art. We'll look at things that we call para-theatrical forms of performance, so things like social protests or political rituals of various kinds. Even the personal rituals of personal roles and personal costuming and things like that. And we also look at things like how social systems that don't seem to be associated with performance at all will often take on the metaphors of performance to talk about what it is that they do. So we just kind of had an example of that at Berkeley a couple of years ago when our last chancellor inaugurated a set of austerity measures in relation to the things that happened at the state by branding them as what he called a high-performance culture. And so he was basically trying to take what was in effect the firing of a lot of our staff members and our librarians and people like that, people who actually make our lives as faculty and students on this campus easier and better, and making it seem like this was a good thing by appealing to our sense of vigor and dynamism and personal achievement and cultural efficiency and organizational efficiency and things like that. So those are the kinds of things that performance studies people tend to be interested in and think about. The presentation that I'm giving today is part of a larger project on the performance cultures of neoliberalism in the kind of tech triangle between Silicon Valley, the southern coastal cities in China, Shenzhen, Shanghai, places like that, and Tokyo. And the presentation that I'm doing today is from a chunk of that project about ideas about creativity and the ways that our ideas about creativity have been shifted, especially in policy arenas around education and urban planning. And I'll start with a quick anecdote about something that happened to me about 6 months ago that is kind of part of why I'm working on this project. So I was sitting in a cafe about 6 months ago with a copy of Richard Florida's The Rise of the Creative Class, the 10th anniversary edition of it. And a woman came over to me who was in her 50s, who was obviously a very enthusiastic reader of this book. And she came over and started rhapsodizing about how wonderful she thought it was, and that it was so great that somebody had started to think about how our cities could be this really different place than what they had been before, and it could make our cities more vibrant and exciting and all of these things. And at the end of sort of rhapsodizing about this, she turned to me and she said, "Are you a planning student?" And I said, "No, I teach in the theater department at Berkeley." And she got really embarrassed by this. And she sort of like backtracked and said, "Oh, I didn't know that his ideas had become so interesting to so many people in all of these different fields." And then ran away back to her seats before I could say, well, you know, actually, in Richard Florida's other book, The Flight of the Creative Class, he talks about how the transformations of our cities were actually initiated by people who were artists. that they started to come about on the move of artists into neighborhoods that they previously hadn't occupied before, and that the kinds of transformations of the cities that he was kind of interested in talking about had really been built by artists, and that sort of white-collar professionals like people who worked in law and finance and medicine and even urban planning kind of followed them after they had already transformed those spaces. And the statement that she made to me in her sort of like surprise and worry about the fact that somebody who was from a theater department might be interested in what Richard Florida might have to say seemed to be kind of part of this moment when we were thinking about creativity as something that didn't really involve artists, as something that maybe artists benefited from, rather than something that they actively engaged or engendered themselves. So that's kind of part of what I'm trying to think about. I'm sort of assuming two pieces of key context for the presentation today. One of which is this argument that there's an entity that, thanks to Richard Florida, we rightly or wrongly call the creative class. I'm sure that a lot of you are actually familiar with Florida's term, but for those of you who aren't, are going to need a quick refresher. Florida published this book, The Rise of the Creative Class, in 2001. In which he argued that the massive changes in kind of social norms and labor structures that animated the second half of the 20th century were not a result of things like economic shifts or social displacements, but of what he called the rise of human creativity as the key factor in our economy and our society. For the first time, our economy is powered by creativity. The ability to create new forms provides the decisive source of competitive advantage and has come to be the most highly prized commodity in our economy. And he made an argument that creativity is practiced by a group of people that are unique in several ways, so much so that they deserve to be referred to as their own class. And the members of the creative class tend to have the following kinds of characteristics in common. They engage in work whose function is to, as he put it, create new forms, which is actually the standard definition of creativity in a kind of research subfield on creativity that I'll talk about in a little bit. So I'll come back to that phrase, the creation of new forms. This group is basically an extension of an older labor category that we used to in the 80s and 90s refer to as knowledge workers. They're basically people who, as Richard Florida puts it, instead of working with their physical bodies, work with their minds instead. And they tend to be united by a distinctive set of work goals, personal tastes, and politics that include things like the desire for a labor structure that stresses independence and autonomy. They tend to embrace secular rational values. They make, as he puts it, nonconformity mainstream. As he claims, they tend toward a tolerance of immigrants and alternative sexualities. I think this last note of Florida's is maybe one of the kind of most contentious of his claims. I'm not sure to what extent that actually stands up under scrutiny. There are other elements of his definition that also may not stand up under scrutiny. But either way, this category has become the backbone for a whole suite of policy initiatives, especially in urban planning and in education. And in the articles that you read for today, or that I had posted to the website, Andrew Ross and Ruth Stewart both talk about how the creative class argument or earlier precedents of it have been used by civic governments in a lot of different locales to lure development to their cities. Various government agencies have seen luring these kind of creative industries organizations, as Andrew Ross puts it, as a way to transform post-industrial collapse into something that seems like a more economically stable alternative. Although, as Ross details, the jury is very much out on the extent to which that has actually been the case. And having said that, Florida has a lot of critics, One of the biggest arguments made against his notion of the creative class is that this category may not actually meaningfully exist in terms of the identities of its supposed members. That this group isn't really a class in either the economic sense, i.e. they're not really unified in terms of their personal income, and nor in a kind of Marxist sense. So they don't necessarily have the same relationship to mechanisms of production, for example. An even bigger criticism, I think, is that Florida doesn't really acknowledge that his category frequently operates as a form of labor management. This is an argument that Andrew Ross makes, I think, particularly well in that essay that you read for today. He says that one of the things that really unites these kind of disparate professions that Florida pulls together in his book is an increasingly precarious labor system. And I pulled a couple of key quotes from Ross's essay in which he describes this problem. At one point he argues that the ethnographic, can you guys actually read this? Mm-hmm. Not so much. Oh, that's perfect. He says the ethnographic evidence on knowledge in CI workplaces shows that sacrificial labor, market overexposure, and self-exploitation are still chronic on-the-job characteristics. In this respect, arguably the most instrumentally valuable aspect of the creative work tradition is the carryover of coping strategies developed over centuries to help practitioners endure a feast or famine economy in return for the promise of success and acclaim. The combination of this coping mentality with a production ethos of aesthetic perfectibility is a godsend for managers looking for employees capable of self-discipline under the most extreme job pressure. It is no surprise that the artist has been seen as the new model worker for high-risk, high-reward employment. And he goes on to write that the preferred labor profile now is more typical of the eponymous struggling artist whose long-abiding vulnerability to occupational neglect is now magically transformed under the new order of creativity into a model of enterprising, risk-tolerant pluck. I really love that last phrase about how what we're all supposed to be are these sort of like enterprising, risk-tolerant, plucky people. And he's sort of like moving down to the next quote. He says that the creative industries become the ones to follow all kinds of jobs, oh, that's supposed to be kinds of jobs, not kids of jobs, sorry, may well look more and more like musicians' gigs. Nice work if you can get it. And this has led to kind of this nickname for the new economy, which is the gig economy, which if any of you between undergraduate and coming back to school as urban planners know, it's really, really hard to find the old kind of jobs that people used to feel, the white-collar jobs that had benefits and full-time employment and all kinds of things associated with them. So that's one part of the context for my current work. The second bit of context is that some of the criticisms of Florida's definition of the term, namely that he ignores the significant income disparities that characterize the members of the class, particularly along the lines of what we might think of as the kind of arts and education end of that spectrum on the one hand, versus the tech worker at the other end of that spectrum, have come home to roost in some particularly powerful and spectacular ways recently. The most obvious manifestation of which, locally, has been the Google Bus protests, of which this performance intervention by a woman named Leslie Dreyer is one of my favorites. There's another one that she did, that I'm going to send Susan a link to so you can see it, where she actually had dancers dressed in the Google colors going dance in front of the buses so that the buses couldn't actually take off. And they talked about what it would mean to move from the idea of a free information society to one where we all got benefits. It was really interesting. So the term Google Bus protest is really kind of a rhetorical umbrella for the public backlash against a range of issues, including things like increasing concerns over the surveillance society and privacy rights, which has been kind of a smaller dimension and a quieter dimension of the Google Bus protests, but more visibly a backlash against the differential impact of this kind of astronomical rise in the cost of living locally, which has intensified social bifurcation all over the Bay Area, but particularly in San Francisco, which has the fastest growing level of income inequality in the United States right now. And while all kinds of people have been affected by this change, including the elderly, the working class, in many ways the protests are being organized and led by folks who at one point were very many of them middle class themselves. They're educated, they're college attendees and so forth, but who now find themselves being displaced residentially from urban neighborhoods that offer desirable amenities, things like good schools, healthy food, arts access. In other words, they find themselves relegated to neighborhoods where those amenities are more scarce and interpret that displacement, often correctly, as a loss of economic status, of social power, of autonomy, and so forth. Ross makes the important observation in his chapter that cities with vibrant creative industries often experience significant class polarization. He gives you several examples of where that's happened. He spends some time talking about what happened in Glasgow after it was recreated as kind of the European city of culture in the 90s. So what has happened in the Bay Area in the last 20 years is kind of this standard experience for cities all over the world that have a kind of high creative class index in the way that Florida would talk about at the end of his book. And we seem to be leading that trend within the United States in San Francisco, so we're sort of ground zero for a lot of this stuff in a lot of ways. But one of the things that makes the local protests notable is the way that they take the high-tech world as their kind of primary villain in these protests, which is why Google ends up being the sort of like eponymous figure in the name of those protests. So if we take as a given Florida's contention that cities are now this kind of spatial domain of the creative class, then we're in the midst of a tearing of the fabric of that class, in which the relations that bound kind of disparate subgroups of that class are now no longer tenable to the extent that they ever were. And I think that you could make an argument that maybe they never were quite tenable. But given that Florida's conception of class was kind of conspicuously oblivious to the economic disparities of its members, it shouldn't be a surprise that the economic issues are sort of at the center of a lot of these tensions, of where these battles are being fought. But I wonder whether the economic issues are really the whole story in what's going on with this idea of this breaking apart of the creative class. And this gets me into the sort of heart of what I'm thinking about in this project, or this part of the project, which is to ask how the term creativity came to mean the things that Florida says it means in that book. You can make the argument that Florida's category is just kind of flawed because he has this fundamental misunderstanding of what creativity actually is, and that he's using a kind of debased or corrupted conception of that term. And that's the kind of argument that a lot of people like me who are in the arts very often make about him. That we shouldn't use the term creativity to describe people outside of the arts necessarily, or maybe outside of architecture. And here's a literary scholar, Raymond Williams, making exactly that kind of claim. In a book called Keywords, where he looks at a lot of different terms that tend to be used in the analysis of culture and society, he looks at the term creativity, and he says the word puts a necessary stress on originality and innovation. And when we remember its history, we can see that these are not trivial claims. The difficulty arises when a word once intended, and often still intended, to embody a high and serious claim becomes so conventional as a description of certain general kinds of activity that it's applied to practices for which, in the absence of the convention, nobody would think of making such claims. Thus, any imitative or stereotyped literary work can be called by convention creative writing, and advertising copywriters officially describe themselves as creative. Now, there's a certain kind of disdain that operates in Williams' definition here, which I suspect is pretty commonplace, actually, and would certainly have been common in the kind of casual conception of the term prior to Florida's writing. But the big question to me is, how did we get from the concept of creativity that operates in Williams' writing here to the concept of it that operates for Florida, where the artist kind of doesn't really operate in his horizon of possibility much at all. He mentions artists as being members of the creative class, but really almost all of the data for his class comes from people who are workers in the IT sector. So he kind of drops the artists out when he's actually trying to figure out who the creative class really are in detail. So it turns out that creativity is one of those terms that's had a really rather complicated history, and then its meaning has been quite varied for a long time prior even to the 20th century. So initially, at least in Western culture, prior to the Renaissance, creativity was a quality that was really associated with the divine, in the sense of the creation in Genesis, right? So creativity is something that really only God has access to, or can invoke or engage. And that the notion that people who were artists had a creative capacity is something that really doesn't happen until the Renaissance when, with this kind of beginning conception of the individual, artists are allowed to be seen as creative figures. And it's a term that still carries with it a kind of association of a notion of an elect or an elite group of people. In the 19th century, creativity becomes a term that's actually used to differentiate the artist from the artisan. So, in other words, creativity is that capacity that allows for a kind of transformative, generative element, as opposed to someone who's just a skilled laborer. So in the early 19th century, you have the beginning of using the term creativity to make what is in effect a class distinction, i.e. somebody who has a kind of intellectual capacity versus someone who just works with their bodies. This you can sort of hear echoed in Florida's definition when he talks about how members of the working class work mainly with their physical bodies and members of the creative class work mainly with their minds. That's a kind of notion of creativity that actually goes back to the 19th century. In the late 19th and early 20th century, a variety of people become kind of interested in thinking about what creativity is and are trying to sort of define it in more specific ways. So you have people like Freud and other psychoanalysts trying to kind of grapple with what it is. And in the early 20th century, John Dewey, who's the American pragmatist philosopher, starts to grapple with the term. And he does so kind of in two overlapping areas. He does it in his attempt to understand what it is that people experience when they view a work of art. And in some ways, more importantly, he starts to also think about how we might inculcate our children with creativity in the classroom. So for those of you who are more familiar with Dewey as just a philosopher, one of the other things that he did that was really important was work as a kind of educational pioneer. He created the lab classroom at the University of Chicago. He was really interested in trying to think about how we might teach children differently that would allow them to be more lively thinkers. And late in his career, he became particularly interested with that capacity of creativity and the importance of that capacity as a way to work, as a way to serve as a kind of safety net against the lures of authoritarian politics. So creativity could be a way to cultivate a kind of democratic citizenship. Post-World War II, the shift kind of focuses, and a really important shift occurs, which is that creativity becomes the object of scientific research for the first time. And into the creativity field enters a military psychologist named J.P. Guilford, who was a really interesting guy. He was hired by the Navy in the Second World War to figure out how to get people who were in training camp to become pilots for the Second World War to pass basic training more easily and quickly. They had had really high failure rates, but to do so in ways that actually made them good pilots so they weren't just going out and crashing planes all over the place during the war. And after the war, he makes the scientific study of creativity a priority for research psychologists. And he says that it's important for two reasons. One, for technological economic reasons. He sees those things as conjoined. He says things like the enormous economic value of new ideas is generally recognized. One scientist or engineer discovers a new principle or develops a new process that revolutionizes the industry. Again, you can kind of hear Florida echoing this idea of what creativity is and why it's important. And he also thinks that it's crucial to winning the Cold War. That the way that America is going to win the Cold War is by having more creative figures involved in particularly the technological challenges of the scientific age than, say, the Soviet Union is. And when Sputnik was actually launched, he had this big lament that he gave actually to an arts college in California, where instead of talking to this group of artists about why they might be interested in creativity or even asking them to tell him about creativity, instead he complains about how the United States actually wasn't the first country to launch a satellite. He says, by all the expectations that should follow from our supposed scientific and technological superiority, such a thing shouldn't have happened. We, and not Russia, should have been the first to accomplish this historical event, which properly stirred the imagination and the admiration of the whole world. And Guilford is kind of important for doing things like democratizing our notions of creativity, but also simultaneously removing it from the realm of art. He begins a kind of tradition in creativity research where the psychologists want to define creativity And when they want creativity, they'll mention artists as people with creative capacity and practices, but almost never turn to them as the reason for why we should be thinking about creativity. The real reason for why creativity is important is its economic capacity or its technological capacity. And that characteristic kind of lingers as a hallmark of creativity research, even into the contemporary period. In the late 1980s, in 1988, this guy named Mark Brunko founds a journal called the Creativity Research Journal. That's the first time there's a journal that's dedicated to harnessing people from a lot of different disciplines that are thinking about creativity. So it's trying to get creativity research out of the realm of just psychologists and trying to get people from, say, education or business studies to think about what creativity is or to write about it. It's kind of the gold standard journal in our field today. And Brunko, kind of piggybacking on some of the ideas that come up with Guilford, believes very much that our conceptions of creativity are too much beholden to the realm of the arts. He argues that we need to kind of divorce ourselves from what he calls the arts bias. He says that the misunderstanding of creativity that equates it with he defines the art bias as the misunderstanding of creativity that equates it with artistic talent, which is the result that only individuals with artistic talent are labeled as creative. And I think that while we might want to applaud Brunko for wanting to think about creativity in this more democratic spirit, i.e. that there might be people who are creative in all kinds of ways in their everyday life, that's something that people who work on creativity studies who are highlighted in this journal are really invested in. At the same time, it's also hard not to see work like this as contributing to the ways in which we're erasing artists from our notions of a creative class, just like that woman in the cafe that I was talking to, and which we're actually witnessing spatially now inside of our cities as artists become kind of driven out of them by the rising cost of living. And here's the real kicker for me about all of this, which is true for a number of people who are worried about what's happening with the bifurcations of income inequality, which is to ask things like, what will happen to our cities if they just become these kind of these resort islands for the super wealthy? And if our cities are these domains of creativity that have lost their artists, what will happen to them? What can we imagine an urban space that doesn't have artists inside of it, or that has them relocated so far physically outside of it? What would that do to our experience of the urban? And what will happen to artists if they can no longer afford to live in areas that actually have infrastructure for their activities? I think that's another question. So both what happens to the cities and what happens to the artists if these two things become divorced from one another. I think that's the real challenge. And that's the thing that we actually need help from people in urban planning to think about and to deal with. So thanks. And for those of you who want to do more reading about this stuff, there are a couple of bibliographies in the back of this PowerPoint, so when Susan puts it online, you can go and read some more of this material for yourself.
Thank you so much, Shannon. That was a really great critique of Florida from the performance studies point of view. And I want to open up by asking, how do you look at getting back to performance, the performance of creativity by the folks who are walking around the Mission District in whatever hats or whatever clothes they put on in the morning? I mean, what's the difference? And when they go to their offices or to their studios, they are performing either art or coding or whatever folks do. How do you link the performance of their duties with kind of, the spectacle, what we see on the streets? Is that, you just started out by describing an encounter in public.
So I think, actually, I'm going to turn your question around a little bit and say that for me, actually, the thing that's kind of more interesting is to think about not the spectacle of what the artists are doing, but the ways in which the members of the creative class that are kind of what Florida is really interested in, i.e. the people who are working in the IT sector, the way that they have turned to a lot of those modes of self-presentation and that kind of performance of the self in order to identify who they are, in order to sort of make a statement about themselves. So, the fact that people who work in what a generation or two ago, my father worked in Silicon Valley when I was growing up, and so my father's kind of like an IT engineer kind of guy. And when I was growing up, the people who worked in his sector all wore suit. They wore a tie, they wore a button-up shirt, they wore all this kind of stuff. And now there's been a kind of revolt against that mode of middle-class, white-collar self-presentation towards what looks like more like what an artist would wear, what we think of as an artist wear. So in other words, the kind of revolts against middle-class propriety that we saw in, say, the 50s with like the beatniks are now being taken up by people in other sectors in order to announce their creative capacity, right? That this is part of how they perform the ways that they are part of a different part of that sector of the creative class. So that's kind of the part of that world that I'm kind of more interested in, is the ways in which these guys who work for major international multi-million-dollar companies all claim to be these kinds of, claim visually, are making a visual claim to being a sort of member of the bohemian set, right? Like that's a kind of interesting set of shifts. So, right, like why we all have like $400 hoodies that we can buy, apparently.
Question for Will.
Yeah, I guess just taking this idea of bohemianism and also the role of patronage in art, I think recalls something that's been going on in the Bay Area for over a century now, I think, which is the Bohemian Grove in Canton, north of San Francisco. And I think that kind of provides this prototypical, for those of you who haven't heard, it's this kind of boys' camp for industrialists that a lot of the railroad barons and Gettys and Fishers and maybe not Fishers, but right there. But all these white rich men mostly go up there. But they also have this component of artists that they would bring, and playwrights and poets.
And they would do performances.
Right, so it was literally this bifurcated class of, these were the masters of the universe, but then they would have this kind of very specific artistic mission. And I mean, something today, and again, I know people have very polarized feelings about this as well, but something like Burning Man, where you see some of today's tech captains of industry going to blend in and wear their hoodie and go out to the desert. And I personally, I've been to Burning Man once, and I think there's a lot to admire in the art culture there and in kind of the anti-commercial ethos, but you have to look at, I think, the Bohemian Grove and Burning Man and San Francisco and wonder, what is the future of the city?
That's a piece of this that I'm trying to figure out right now. Like, the thing that's really interesting is that the old iteration of like the Bohemian Club and the Masters of the Universe, like there are so many people who are working in the arts world right now, especially in like the theater world, who wish that stuff was what the younger money crowd were like, because those guys, as deeply problematic as the values that they espoused and enacted and operated in all the time, they were also patrons of major arts infrastructures, right? Like that's part of the stuff actually that Lou Stewart talks about in the essay that you guys are looking at today, right? She makes that really interesting thing, shift that she marks about the difference of thinking about art as a way that you show off your wealth to art as a generator of wealth, right? She makes that kind of really weird shift, right? So that's the kind of move from like what's happening in the Bohemian Club to like Richard Florida's argument, right? Or the creative industries argument that Ross is trying to track in that essay. The thing that has shifted, I think, with like the new tech money crowd is the way that they're really not willing to put money into arts infrastructure. They're willing to fund individual projects, right? So you can have Kickstarter campaigns for all kinds of like one-off projects, like for a Spike Lee movie or for a piece of composition that you're working on or whatever it is. But those things don't necessarily sustain arts institutions. And that's a really complicated shift to think about what's going on, right? And at the same time that like Kickstarter seems to be this platform to support the arts and arts activities, at the same time, like the most popular and most sort of like quickly wealth-generating project on Kickstarter, I think, was actually for a sustainable food, right? Like that's the thing that people are actually putting money to on Kickstarter. So there's some shift about really complicated shift about how art is being funded around the tech world that is a piece of this, and I don't quite have all of the tissues of that worked out and traced out yet. So but that's something I'm trying to figure out right now.
Hi, I shouldn't ask questions because I'm a visitor, but I was really struck by your last sentence about the city. And I guess as a planning historian, the way I would see Richard Florida is the last in a sequence of silver bullets to save the American city. You could start with, I don't know, urban renewal through festival marketplaces, in-town ballparks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And none of them worked. And I would say Richard Florida's didn't actually work either. Either it was unnecessary in places like New York where they didn't need it, or else it's kind of tragic in some place like Detroit. And so maybe all of this is part of a transformation of the urban form in which actually artists might live in the suburbs. And in fact, the suburbs are ever more diverse, and the center city is ever less diverse. But I mean, to me, that's fine.
Well, I think like the displacement and the infrastructure question, I think, is where that gets tricky, right? Like, so I'll say so as somebody who's a research academic and has like a fairly solid income, who's partnered to an architect who, in the psych research on creativity, architects are sort of like the premier figures, right? That they're the most creative figures because they have to deal with so many different problems and so many issues and deal with style and design all at the same time. We don't make enough money between the two of us to buy a home in a decent school district for our 3-year-old anywhere within a 45-minute commute of where either of us work. Right, so there is a problem, and we're at the sort of, I would argue, the high end of the income bracket for either of those fields. Like my friends who work actually as like playwrights or as poets or as visual artists, like they're in a much more difficult place than we are. So I think that while on the one hand that question of like the way that the suburbs may become really vibrant and exciting is only true to the extent that we have other infrastructural amenities like a good education system in those places to aid that vibrancy. So, I don't know, that's what it feels like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was an observation.
I think you're totally right about that thing about the silver bullet, though, about the last silver bullet. Ruth Stewart talks about that in the essay that I had put it up today. She talks about how this is sort of like in a sequence with things like the stadium buildings and things like that. So she talks about that. I think there's another hand up somewhere.
I thought it was interesting that you're saying about how there's this adoption of a bohemian aesthetic to try and fit in, but I think that also it's one of the mechanisms of kind of like backlash against this incoming creative class also would be, like I think of all these articles that were on the internet at the time of began about how there's all these silly questions that are being posted on Facebook by first-time burners who don't understand, and they're trying to fit in, but they can't because they're not authentically part of this culture. Or I think about just a lot of what I hear in San Francisco of like the image, which is an aesthetic image also, and the growth of one of the tech bro, and how that is something that can be visually identified also. And it doesn't fit in with the real bohemian in San Francisco, so I was wondering your thoughts on that, I suppose.
About
how there is this
what the authenticity barrier is. I think that there's a kind of interesting question about that. Like, I think this gets back in some ways to that quote from Williams at the beginning where he says, like we now talk about all these people as being creative, like the person who's the ad copywriter, who clearly are not. And I do wonder sometimes whether or not, on the arts end of things, we have a kind of territorial defensiveness about creativity, right? Like we kind of don't want to let other people into the cool club because that would mean that we would be giving up the one thing that gives us cultural authority. It's the one part of like cultural capital that we actually still have. So if we allow other people in these other fields to have it, then we have nothing then. So there's a certain amount of defensiveness around that, and particularly, like I would say that that's what's operating when people get mad at people who are first time breaking in. People going and not knowing what the rules are. It's kind of like, no, you didn't know what the rules were at one point yourself. So, and the rules are all just like made up rituals anyway. So really, I think the other side of that is that question about the ways that the tech world is actually shifting in some really uncomfortable ways relative to like its own goals and what is happening within it. So all the parody of like the tech bro, I sort of see as a frustration with the ways in which people who think of themselves as operating in a kind of more creative scientific mode are having what they're doing being taken over by a bunch of people who are basically greedy and are not interested in asking questions or thinking about how we might do things more interestingly or better. Right? So there's a kind of division inside of the tech world itself about what the real goals of those industries should be that I think is really big. Yeah, do we have time for another question?
We're just about at 2 o'clock, but maybe we have one more.
Okay.
I have a question about Detroit because in District of Race like Detroit, so that's a totally different case because like, that city was depopulated, and then the sort of like medium of depopulation is being used in creative idioms. Whereas like San Francisco, it's not like everybody left and then tech came in. It's like this constant. It's like this. It's all sort of combusting at the same time because like tech grew out of a place that already wasn't like completely a ruin, and that's like contested to that idea of like ruin, and then how people are using that to making like that ruin becomes the aesthetic, and that becomes like the medium by which they actually build something. Like it's just really every city is like a different case because of time and depopulation, and then like in Beijing, like it's just constant expansion, constant migration to the city.
Yeah, I think that you're right, that there's a kind of local issue that these cities deal with this stuff differently, or there are different histories of how basically post-industrial malaise set in the US, right, in the US context. So San Francisco actually went through a post-industrial phase too. It was just that it was in the 70s and 80s, and at the end of the 80s, it started being repopulated by people who were more white collar. They just weren't necessarily tech people, right? Like the tech people lived in later, or the tech people who were living in San Francisco and commuting down the peninsula. And now all of the social media people are now located in San Francisco, right? So that's a sort of like different argument about that, and it is very different from Detroit. The stuff in Beijing, I think like anything that you're going to look at in China is going to look so different because this whole history of urbanization and industrialization is like very different from what happened in the US. So you're right, I think that there are at least regional differences between these things, if not like absolutely different urban patterns around it. Yeah, so there's kind of like differential development for sure.
Thank you, that was really great. When you were doing your talk, one thing I was kind of struck by is I'm really fascinated by your kind of genealogy of creativity, right? Kind of fleshing out how it came to be that Richard Florida can talk about creativity in this particular way. And I was really struck, I guess, by what seems like a parallel, maybe in terms of how labor itself has become redefined, so that instead of a sort of Marxian notion of producing and selling one's sort of abstract labor as a wage, now it's human capital. We're not actually laborers, we're entrepreneurs of ourselves, right? Like we invest in our creative capacities and it's yoked to markets and economic success. And I don't know, I guess I was curious if you've come across any intertwinings or interesting ways in which human capital, Gary Becker is sort of the economist who redefined what labor is, and these sorts of redefinitions of creativity.
Well, I think that this is, one of the things that Ross talks about when he says that basically this is a managerial strategy, right? Like one of the things that creativity is useful for if you own a company is it's a way to make people feel like they are benefiting from a more precarious labor situation than they had occupied before, so that now you have to work much longer hours and for lower pay, lower benefits, all kinds of bad things, but you get to wear what you want to wear and you get to go play foosball in the corner with your buddies when you want to, right? So that there's a false set of qualities that people who name themselves as creative workers feel like they are accruing even though their actual economic status might be falling, right? Or their actual like income power might be falling. So I think that's one of the places. That's a short answer to that question. That's a really good question.
Thank you, Shannon. Lots more to talk about.